The parking lot behind the precinct was quiet. Too quiet for a building that handled violent crimes and daily patrol rotations. Agent Julian Cross stood under a flickering light, suit slightly wrinkled from hours of travel, one hand still holding the manila folder he had just delivered to the chief of investigations. The folder contained classified notes from an FBI-led audit targeting corruption inside the city's police force. It was supposed to be a routine handoff, clean, professional, confidential. That's when the footsteps came heavy, purposeful, not rushing but not casual either. 3 local officers emerged from the shadows. They didn't introduce themselves, didn't ask questions. They fanned out. One of them, tall with a square jaw and the kind of overconfidence that came with decades of getting away with things, stepped forward and said, "You lost." Sir Julian turned, calm but alert. "No. Federal business. Just left a meeting with your chief." The officer smirked. "Didn't hear anything about that. Got ID?" Julian nodded, reached slowly toward his jacket. "Sure. I'm reaching for it now," but before his fingers touched the badge, another officer cut him off. "Where you coming from again?" Julian paused. "FBI Internal Affairs." There was a second of silence, then a scoff. "Funny. All the criminals these days got federal stories." Julian didn't smile. "Not a story." But they didn't wait. One officer drew his taser. Julian's hand never left his jacket. He didn't flinch until the trigger clicked. A sharp crack of voltage split the silence. His body dropped hard, controlled only by gravity. His badge hit the pavement just a second after, still open. The man who tased him froze. His eyes followed the flash of gold on black leather. Wait, what the hell did we just do? Another officer leaned in. "That badge real?" One nodded slowly. "It's real." The silence that followed wasn't just guilt. It was recognition. They hadn't tased a suspect. They hadn't stopped a threat. They had assaulted a federal agent, one who was there, not to arrest them, but to audit the system that just tried to erase him. The security camera didn't blink. It captured everything. The posture, the words, the trigger, and the fall. Julian didn't move, but the system behind him was already waking up. Julian Cross had worked cases in 5 states, 2 federal task forces, and spent nearly 9 years navigating the gray lines between local law enforcement and federal oversight. He'd seen departments collapse under their own corruption and watched good cops lose their jobs for reporting bad ones. But he never thought he'd be the one eating pavement outside a precinct with his own badge still warm from the heat of a taser shot. After the incident, the department tried to play it quiet. Internal Affairs didn't file a use of force report. The officers involved weren't publicly named. Julian was taken to the hospital, not handcuffed, not charged, just monitored. His injuries weren't serious, but something deeper cracked. His superiors at the bureau called him in immediately not to offer apologies, but to contain fallout. "The optics are complicated," one supervisor said behind closed doors. "We're already stretched on this case. Your presence was meant to stay low-key. They were more concerned about headlines than accountability." Julian was told to rest, to wait, to keep the file moving quietly, behind the scenes. He didn't rest. He began writing everything down, not just what happened that night, but what led to it. His assignment in that precinct wasn't random. He'd been investigating reports of falsified arrest logs, missing body cam footage, and a suspicious number of internal complaints that disappeared before reaching review. Several of those reports had something in common: suspects who were never charged, never booked, but still bruised. Some of them were black, Some were just poor. All were silenced. Julian had walked into that investigation with the cold logic of a professional. But now, it was personal. Because this wasn't just about a broken chain of command. It was about a broken assumption that his badge would protect him, that the system would recognize its own. He started tracing what really happened in the lead-up to his attack. The officers who confronted him hadn't just been on patrol, they had been tipped off. Julian checked the logbook. His meeting with the chief wasn't listed. He wasn't on any scheduled visitor list. Someone had scrubbed the digital trail, and that someone knew exactly who he was. He requested surveillance footage from the precinct's hallway, citing operational necessity. His access was approved, barely. What he found made his chest tighten. Just hours before his meeting, one of the officers who later stunned him was seen stepping into the chief's office. They spoke for 5 minutes. No audio, no record of the conversation, but the timeline fit. The same officer was the one who first approached Julian in the parking lot. This wasn't a random encounter. It was a message. Still, Julian didn't go to the press. He didn't scream into the wind. He opened a secure case log under internal review protocols and began to piece together every abuse complaint filed against that department in the last 5 years. More than half had been marked inconclusive or lacking evidence. When he mapped the data visually, certain names kept coming up, not just officers, but reviewers, internal auditors, even lawyers. The whole process smelled of routine. Routine neglect. Routine protection. One name in particular, Officer Tanner Briggs, appeared in 7 separate complaints. The same officer who had tased Julian. One complaint from 3 years ago stood out: a witness account from a confidential informant assigned to an unrelated federal case. The informant had been accidentally detained and injured. Julian cross-checked the case file. The medical report listed taser burns. There was no mention of arrest, no charge. The complaint was closed without comment. Julian called an old colleague from Quantico, someone who specialized in internal risk patterns. She pulled restricted memos from the DOJ. What she found shook them both. That precinct wasn't isolated. Several departments in the same district shared similar complaint patterns: misuse of force, vague language, administrative delays, and untraceable dismissals. The deeper they went, the clearer it became. This wasn't about one bad apple. It was about a system with no intention of seeing the rot. And now the rot had touched him. Julian started getting polite warnings from inside the bureau. Not threats, just careful language. You're getting too close to a firestorm. The higher-ups are nervous. Maybe sit this part out. One of the officers on the original audit team was pulled from the case and reassigned. No explanation given. Meanwhile, the officers who attacked Julian kept their positions. One was promoted. Another was reassigned to training oversight. No apologies, no investigation, just movement, just like always. But Julian wasn't interested in apologies. He wanted structure, paper, proof. So he began assembling a private dossier, coded and backed up off-site, detailing every name, every skipped review, every internal blindfold that made his assault possible. He wasn't just building a case. He was building a map, one that didn't point to a single guilty party, but to a culture that mistook silence for order. He still wore his badge, still showed up at headquarters, but something in him had changed. The faith had shifted. The rulebook he believed in had collapsed, not from one night in a parking lot, but from the weight of 1,000 silent edits over years of institutional habit. And for the first time in his career, Julian understood what victims meant when they said they were invisible. Because he hadn't just been attacked, he had been erased. The first fuse lit quietly, buried in a report no one expected to read. Julian had gained access to archived complaints that had been closed without review, marked irrelevant, inconclusive, or resolved on arrival. He traced one case back 3 years to a man listed only as John Doe, tased and hospitalized during what was labeled a routine check. There was no police report, no arrest, no statement from the victim, but a single memo mentioned a transfer request from an FBI field office. That Doe wasn't a random citizen. He was a confidential informant. Julian read the medical file. Second-degree burns, missing audio footage. He stared at the timestamp. It happened 3 blocks from the same precinct that later put him on the ground. That was the first moment he stopped calling it a coincidence. The second fuse sparked inside a conference room. The Bureau called a closed-door strategy session to redirect focus on the audit project. The tone was diplomatic, but the intention was clear: minimize exposure, protect relationships with local departments, and move Julian off the case. He sat in the room, listening. When they finished talking, he opened his laptop. No speeches, no accusations, just footage grainy, quiet, unedited. Security video from the parking lot, captured from a hidden angle. It showed the officers surrounding him, showed his hands down, still, showed the taser fired before any weapon was drawn. He didn't need to narrate. The room said nothing. Then he opened a second tab, slides of internal memos, patterns of dismissed complaints, timestamp matches. At the end of it, he said only one thing: if I were anyone else, I'd be dead. So if this room isn't built to fix that, I'll find one that is. He closed the laptop, left the room. That was the second fuse. The third came when the pressure reached outside the Bureau. Someone leaked a partial summary of Julian's findings anonymously. Not the footage, not the internal memos, just the numbers. Over 30 complaints linked to 5 officers, 1 precinct, 0 disciplinary actions. The story made its way to a civil rights committee inside the Department of Justice. Within a week, the DOJ quietly launched a targeted review into that region's policing practices. No names, no press, just quiet subpoenas. Inside the precinct, rumors started to circulate. Officers whispered about who got named, who was on the list, and who should start cleaning house. Someone in the department began deleting files, except they didn't know Julian had already backed them up. He wasn't chasing them. He was waiting, watching the system react like a cornered animal. Then it happened. Julian was summoned for an internal advisory hearing. Not a disciplinary one, an advisory. The label was just camouflage. He walked into the meeting. Across the table sat 3 Bureau executives. One leaned forward and asked the question gently. Why didn't you follow proper clearance protocols for your data review? Julian didn't blink. Because the proper protocols were designed to ignore what I found. The man across from him sighed. You understand the impact this could have. This isn't just a city precinct. This connects to federal funding, task force integrity, national optics. Julian nodded. That's exactly why I documented everything. They warned him again calmly that he was pushing the limits of his role, that political timing mattered, that the wrong exposure could fracture trust between agencies. He didn't argue. He handed them a single page. The title read, Systemic Risk Index, Corruption Pattern Model V1.3. It wasn't a rant. It was a framework, one he had designed using real data, matching precinct behaviors to statistical warning signs, a tool for early detection. does. A blueprint for reform. The room fell silent again. They didn't endorse it. They didn't reject it. But they couldn't ignore it. That was the third fuse. Each one different. Each one deliberate. None of them loud. But all of them irreversible. By the time Julian left that building, the fire had already started. Julian had spent years decoding systems, how departments hid their errors, how language softened misconduct into procedure, how the real crime was often in the edit, not the act. But this time, the twist didn't come from what he found. It came from who let it happen. As he followed the paper trail backward, one document caught his eye. A routine transfer notice stamped 3 weeks before he was deployed to the precinct. It listed operational support for his audit, naming a mid-tier bureau officer as liaison. But the name rang familiar, an agent he'd met only once, during a training seminar years ago. No, not for ethics, but for surviving scandal by staying invisible. Julian dug deeper. That same agent had logged into Julian's case files hours before he arrived at the precinct. He hadn't added anything. He hadn't updated anything. He had simply viewed the route, the contact, the time. Julian now understood someone had tipped off the precinct. Not an outsider, one of their own. The tasing wasn't a misfire. It was bait. A test to see if Julian would escalate, lose control, or disappear. But they'd underestimated him. He didn't react. He documented. Quietly. He submitted a request to the Office of Inspector General for an independent ethics review, citing potential cross-agency interference. He didn't accuse. He aligned facts. The review was slow, but once started, it couldn't be stopped. It crawled through every message, every sign-in, every clearance log related to his audit. At the same time, Julian made another move. He reached out to a retired federal attorney, a woman who had once defended whistleblowers against DOJ retaliation. He gave her redacted files, names blacked out. Just data, just patterns. She reviewed them for 2 days, then called him and said, "This isn't just a case. This is a culture. If they don't fix it, you won't be the last agent they silence." Still, Julian said nothing publicly, but the pressure grew. Then came the unexpected turn. The family of the man tased 3 years earlier, the one listed only as John Doe, filed a civil claim. They cited new evidence from a confidential source. The lawsuit named the city, the precinct, and several supervisors. But what caught national attention was a single line. Pattern of force targeting federal informants under active DOJ assignment. Julian knew the line had come from his records. He didn't leak it, but someone who believed in the truth did. As the case went public, journalists began digging. One reporter reached Julian. He didn't confirm details. He didn't deny them either. But he said one sentence that made it into the lead of the article: accountability isn't an attack. It's a mirror. What you see in it depends on what you're hiding. Within days, the Bureau launched a formal oversight task force. Internally, it was meant to ease public concern. But the truth was, they needed to control the damage before Congress stepped in. Julian wasn't put in charge, but his system, the index model he'd designed, was adopted for a 6-month trial. And that's when the final shift came, not in court, not online, but in a closed room where he sat across from the same agent who had accessed his files. The man looked tired, still trying to keep the performance up. He opened with, "We didn't know it would go this far." Julian looked at him, quiet for a moment. "You didn't think I'd stay quiet this long either." The man folded, apologized. Not publicly, just to him. And it didn't matter, because Julian wasn't here for apologies. He was here to remind the system it could still bleed. In the weeks that followed, headlines cooled. The civil suit moved forward quietly. The DOJ's internal oversight team expanded its scope. The precinct Julian had investigated was placed under federal monitoring. And the taser incident, it became a cautionary line item in bureau ethics training. Never officially linked to misconduct, but always mentioned with a pause. Julian never released a statement. He didn't need to. The silence around his name had become its own kind of echo, one that unsettled everyone who thought they'd gotten away with it. He was offered a promotion regional director, high clearance, polished office. He declined. Instead, he requested a transfer to the Bureau's academy, not to retire, not to rest, but to teach, to build something better at the roots. He started each new class with the same sentence: "The badge is a mirror. If you think it hides you, you're already dangerous." Students listened. Some nodded. Others shifted in their seats, unsure how to absorb the weight of what he wasn't saying out loud. He never mentioned his case. He didn't have to. His presence carried it. Back in the city, the officer who tased him resigned quietly. No press, no charges, just a signature on a form and a door that didn't open again. Julian didn't celebrate. He didn't watch the news when it aired a retrospective on law enforcement reform in response to growing public concern. He didn't call it justice, because justice would have meant it never happened in the first place. What Julian felt wasn't victory. It was proof. Proof that the system could still blink when you stare back long enough. Proof that quiet resistance, sharpened by truth and timing, could still shift the weight of institutions. One night, long after the academy lights had shut off, Julian stood alone in the training hall, hand resting on the back of a chair. In the silence, he thought about the moment it all started, the crack of a taser, the silence afterward, the badge on the pavement. He didn't relive the pain. He remembered the decision. To stand up, to write it down, to see it through. He didn't want to be a hero. He just wanted to make sure the next person didn't have to be one. And somewhere in another precinct, another room, another set of eyes might pause now before reaching for force, because they know the mirror is watching, and this time, it writes back.